The shelf tag is still there, the product isn't. Statistics Canada reported food prices up 4.7% November 2025. Coffee spiked 28%, beef nearly 18%. Some items aren't just expensive, they're gone. One group saw this coming because they were trained. Canadian veterans were counting down 7 foods that vanish in a crisis and what veterans grab instead. Number 7 is something you bought last week. Number 7 is olive oil. For decades, a bottle of extra virgin olive oil sat on the kitchen counter, a staple for frying eggs or tossing a salad. That changed almost overnight. Statistics Canada tracked a 36% jump in the consumer price index for olive oil between 2024 and 2026. In Atlantic Canada, the spike hit 42%. At the same time, shelf space shrank. 22% less olive oil made it to stores. The reason starts 3,000 miles away. A record drought in Spain cut the Mediterranean harvest in half from 1.5 million tons to just 666,000. Wholesale prices in Andalusia surged past €9.84 per kilogram. Canadian imports from Spain dropped by more than a quarter. Supermarkets responded with contract clauses. When the price broke $13 per liter, Metro swapped in canola olive blends. Veterans don't wait for substitutions. The Canadian Forces ration kits keeps olive oil entirely and stocks canola oil or rendered tallow, both shelf-stable and made for harsh winters. Swap one bottle for canola today and you're following a tradition that's kept prairie kitchens running through every crisis. Number 6. Coffee has become an early casualty on Canadian shelves, with the morning brew turning into a luxury almost overnight. The price of ground coffee jumped 27.8% year over year, while sales volume fell 19% in the prairies alone. The trouble starts half a world away. Brazil's Minas Gerais region endured its worst drought in decades, slashing Arabica yields by 25%. At the same time, Vietnam's Robusta harvest shrank by 18% after months of record low rainfall. Together, these two countries account for nearly 70% of the world's coffee exports. When their crops failed, global prices rose by 30%, and Canadian importers passed those costs straight to the checkout. By April 2025, Costco began locking premium coffee beans behind acrylic cases, and Loblaws shifted 40% of its shelf space to instant coffee, locking in prices at last year's rates. For many, the daily cup is now rationed or skipped. But Canadian veterans and military rations have always relied on instant coffee sachets, cheap, compact, and built to last through a crisis. A single box of powdered coffee can keep your caffeine fix affordable, even when the fancy beans are under lock and key. Number 5. Wheat flour sits at the crossroads of war, drought, and the daily Canadian kitchen. Over 2 years, the price of a basic bag of flour rose 24%, while national sales volume dropped 14%, hitting prairie families the hardest, where shelves lost nearly 1 in 5 bags. The shock didn't start at home. When the Ukraine-Russia war halted Black Sea wheat exports, global supply shrank by 12% almost overnight. Drought across the US plains followed, cutting American yields by another 9%. By fall 2025, world wheat futures jumped from $6.50 to $8.20 a bushel, a 26% surge that rippled through every bakery and grocery contract. At Sobeys, shelf space for generic white flour shrank by 40%, replaced by pricier blends and smaller bags. But Canadian veterans and prairie households have a backup. OAT flour packed in 10-kilo bags and sealed in mylar, holds for 2 years in a cool pantry. It's the same principle found in military ration packs, a stable, local grain that keeps bread on the table even when wheat is scarce. Your weekend loaf can still rise if you store what lasts. Number 4. Sunflower oil tells a story of global choke points and local substitutions. Before the war in Ukraine, that country supplied nearly 60% of the world's sunflower oil. When Russian tanks crossed the border, those exports collapsed. Ukrainian and Russian shipments together dropped by more than 2/3. The International Food Policy Research Institute tracked a 38% spike in world sunflower oil prices within months. And in Canada, the consumer price index for sunflower oil jumped 41%. Sales volume tumbled, down 23% in the prairies and interior BC, where shelves lost over a third of their sunflower oil facings. Imports dried up, and the price per liter surged past $4.20. Retailers like Metro didn't wait. They issued memos. If the price broke that threshold, swap every bottle for Canadian canola oil. Higher Lake canola, grown from Manitoba to the Peace River Valley, became the default on grocery shelves. For Canadian veterans and prairie households, this was nothing new. The individual meal pack has always relied on canola oil, packed in 1-liter bottles with a 3-year shelf life. In veteran-run pantries, bulk canola tanks replaced imported sunflower oil without hesitation. When global supply lines snap, Canada's own canola steps up. But as prices climb, attention shifts. If edible oil is this volatile, what happens when protein costs take off? Number 3, beef is where the sticker shock truly sets in. Over just 12 months, the consumer price index for beef jumped 17.7%, the sharpest rise for any meat on Canadian shelves. In the prairies, where beef is a weekly staple, sales volume dropped 12% as families cut back. The root of the problem isn't just inflation, it's the shrinking herd. Drought across the West drove feed costs up by 25%, forcing ranchers to sell off cattle early. The Canadian Cattlemen's Association reports a 5% drop in national herd inventory, a loss of 250,000 head in a single year. At the same time, export demand surged 22%, with more Canadian beef heading overseas to meet contracts in Asia. That double squeeze, fewer cattle at home, more shipping out, means less beef on your local shelf and a price tag that keeps climbing. Costco tried to cushion the blow with 5-kilogram beef reserve bulk packs, but even those move fast. Loblaws and smaller retailers now limit premium cuts to keep inventory from vanishing. For those who remember the old military ration packs, the lesson is clear: swap one fresh roast for shelf-stable cans. The Canadian Forces IMP includes 400 grams of canned beef and 200 grams of jerky, both good for 2 years in a pantry. Veterans running community pantries in Nova Scotia and the prairies keep hundreds of kilograms of canned beef on hand, rotating stock every 6 months. The data is undeniable. When fresh beef gets scarce, the only reliable protein is the one you already have on your shelf. Number 2, honey has quietly faded from Canadian shelves. And the reason is crawling beneath the surface. The price of honey jumped 22% nationwide between 2024 and 2026, with jars costing $2 more per liter in most grocery aisles. But the real shock comes from the fields. Honey production dropped by 18.3% in a single year, and beekeepers across Nova Scotia and Prince Edward Island faced the steepest losses. The culprit is the varroa mite, a pest smaller than a pinhead but devastating for bee colonies. Agriculture and Agri-Food Canada tracked a 30% surge in colony loss rates after a warm, wet summer made mite infestations nearly impossible to control. With fewer bees, local honey vanished, and stores shifted what little was left to specialty aisles. Loblaws responded by promoting maple syrup and agave blends as cheaper alternatives, while sales of honey fell 15% nationwide. For many families, the toast and tea ritual suddenly felt like a luxury. But Canadian veterans and military rations have always planned for sweetener shortages. The individual meal pack swaps honey for powdered brown sugar and a half-liter of maple syrup, shelf-stable, homegrown, and ready to last through a hard winter. Prairie pantries often keep a 25-kilo sack of sugar sealed in the cold room, and a jug of syrup from the last spring run. When honey gets scarce, your toast stays sweet if you lean on the old Canadian standbys. And finally, in first place, canned mackerel and sardines have all but vanished from Atlantic Canadian shelves, marking the sharpest food shortage of the crisis. The Department of Fisheries and Oceans imposed a total moratorium on Atlantic mackerel for 2025 and 2026, reducing the total allowable catch to 0 tons. That single decision sent shockwaves through grocery aisles. The consumer price index for canned fish surged by 35%, while the availability index in Atlantic Canada dropped 27% in just 2 years. So bays cut shelf space for domestic mackerel by 40%, scrambling to fill the gap with imported Moroccan sardines. Those imports came at a cost. Moroccan sardine prices jumped another 35%, and the classic 95-gram can now costs nearly $3, if you can find it at all. In Dartmouth, one veteran-run pantry keeps a 200-kilogram reserve of canned sardines, rotating stock every 3 months to stay ahead of expiry dates. The Canadian Forces individual meal pack has relied on the same 95-gram sardine cans for decades, designed to last 3 years in a cool pantry. For veterans and rural households, the message is clear. When the local catch disappears, only imported tins remain, and even those are running out. If you want a reliable source of protein through the next supply shock, grab a 12-can case before it's gone. That's not fear, it's the kind of practical planning that's kept Canadian families fed through every crisis, from the cod collapse to the present day. Across all 7 foods, one pattern stands out. In a crisis, imported or perishable staples vanish first. Preparedness isn't panic. It's a lesson Canada's veterans and families have lived for generations. In tough times, self-reliance isn't old-fashioned, it's survival. Which pantry habit has kept your family strong?